Picture a farm kitchen in the Pennsylvania Dutch country, late in the season. The lamps lit, the whole neighbourhood crowded in for what they called a schnitzing bee. Schnitz is their word for a cut piece, a dried apple. Hands moved all evening long. One paring knife lifted a single ribbon of peel that never broke. Another hand cored the fruit and turned it into pale rings. The children threaded those rings onto long strings of thread, and here is the number that holds the whole night together. You dry a sound apple down to about 20% moisture, no more, and it will hang on a rafter and feed you clear through winter. 20%. That is the line between food that lasts and food that moulds. They did not have a meter. They had their fingers, and they knew leather from wet by touch. Now those strings went up over the hearth, up in the attic, anywhere dry and moving with air. A whole winter of sweetness hung on string, costing nothing but an evening and a knife. I want to plant one thing before we go further. Somebody built the first big machines that took this work out of the farm kitchen. Men ran the early commercial fruit evaporators back in the last century. Whatever became of them, and what they did to this skill, I will get to that at the very end. Hold it in your mind. Today most folks could not dry a winter's worth of apples if the store closed on a Monday. They would stand in the kitchen with a bag of fruit going soft and not know the first cut to make. That is not a moral failing, friend. Nobody sat them down and showed them. The knowing skipped a generation or two, quiet as anything. But here's the twist. Nobody outlawed drying apples. No sheriff, no law, no company ever came and forbade it. It simply slipped out of the house, and I can show you how. Start with sugar. In 1887, Henry Havemeyer pulled most of the cane sugar refining in this country under one roof. The American Sugar Refining Company, the outfit the papers called the Sugar Trust. Over the decades that followed, the price of white sugar fell and fell. Sweetness got cheap. It came in a paper sack for pennies. Now I will be square with you. Nobody wrote down that cheap sugar killed the schnitzing bee. That link is my reading of it, not a line in any ledger. But think it through. When sweetness costs almost nothing at the counter, a whole evening spent drying fruit for its sugar starts to feel like a chore instead of a harvest. Then came the machines. From the 1870s into the 1890s after the war, mechanical fruit evaporators spread through parts of New York and out into the Midwest. These were heated cabinets and belts that dried apples by the ton. Drying stopped being a thing your household did and became a thing a factory did, for sale and for export. The skill left the kitchen and moved to the loading dock. And there was one more turn, the gentlest one. Refrigeration and cold storage came along and kept fresh apples sound for months. Commercial canning put applesauce in a tin on the shelf. Between them, they made drying optional. Not forbidden, not banned, just no longer necessary for most families. That is the honest shape of it. When a thing stops being needed, the hands that knew it stop teaching it. So the grocery bill crept up the ledger a little at a time, quiet as frost climbing a window pane. A sack of sugar here, a tin of sauce there, a crate of cold-stored apples in February that your great-grandmother would have dried herself in October. None of it looked like a loss. Every single line of it looked like progress, and most of it was. I am not here to tell you the icebox was a villain. What I am here to tell you is that a skill your grandfather's people held in their hands, a skill that cost nothing, quietly became a thing you buy. Sweetness that once hung on a string over the hearth now rings up at the register. I keep a journal in the house, passed down, and the leather of the cover has gone worn smooth as a creek stone from all the hands that held it. There is drying in those pages. Ring the apple, thread the ring, hang it where the air moves. That was pantry law once. It was as common as knowing how to bank a fire. And the strange part, the part that ought to bother you, is how fast common knowledge can go rare. It did not take 100 years. Cheap sugar, a few decades of factory evaporators, and an icebox in the corner. And the schnitzing bee faded from a neighbourhood event down to a word in an old cookbook most folks cannot pronounce. But the apple has not changed one bit. It still dries the same way it dried on those strings a century ago. The knife still works. The rafter still holds. Everything those farm kitchens knew is still true, still waiting, still just as cheap as it ever was. All that went missing was the knowing itself. That is the whole quiet story of how the drying slipped away, friend. And it all turns on one number I'm about to hand you. That is the whole quiet story of how the drying slipped away, friend. And it all turns on one number I'm about to hand you. Here is the number, 20%. That is the moisture line. The National Centre for Home Food Preservation puts it plain. A dried apple has to come down to about 20% moisture or less before it is safe to store away. Miss that line by a hair and you get mould by Christmas. Hit it clean, and you get a slice that carries all the way through to spring. One number. It stands between a full pantry and a ruined one, and almost nobody teaches it anymore. You will know you have reached it by feel. The ring turns leathery and pliable. You fold it and it bends without snapping, and no bead of wet shows in the crease. That is the very target your people were reading with their thumbs, long before anybody thought to write it down. I'm Christopher Marin, and my family has worked this same patch of ground for 7 generations. The oldest thing I own is a leather journal that belonged to Samuel Marin, my great-great-grandfather. The cover is soft as a glove now, and the ink has faded to the colour of weak tea. He wrote about apples in the fall of his life. One line I have read 100 times over. He put it this way: "Pare them thin, string them by the fire, and the poorest year will still feed you sweet in March." That was his whole method in a single sentence. Thin slices, low steady heat, a sweetness saved back for the hungry end of winter. Now I am going to show you my hand a little, because you ought to know where this list is headed. Down near the bottom, at number 2, waits the one hazard that can hide inside a beautiful-looking batch, and the Food and Drug Administration drew its line at 50 parts per billion. I am not touching her until we are near the floor of this countdown, and at number 3 sits the whole Pennsylvania Dutch tradition, the dried apple they called Schnitz, and the winter supper they built out of it. I will get there in good time, but not yet. Hold those 2 in the back of your mind. I've set all of this down in one place. My book is called The Lost Plant Remedies Almanac, a season-by-season record of the pantry skills your people practiced and mine nearly forgot. And if you keep it on the shelf beside your flour, you will never lose one of these old ways again. And if this is doing you any good at all, do one small thing. Subscribe. Not for me. Every soul who follows along carries these old ways into one more kitchen, and a skill shared is a skill that does not die with us. That is the only reason I ask it. So we begin the countdown, 7 down to 1. Number 7 is the smallest warning on the whole list, and it is about the part of the apple most folks never think twice about, the seeds. Apple seeds carry a compound called amygdalin. It is a cyanogenic compound, which is a long way of saying the body can turn it into something you do not want in any quantity. Now, I will not stand here and hand you a dose, because that is not a number I can give you honestly. What I will give you is the simple rule instead. Core your apples fully before they ever touch the tray. Do not dry the seeds. Do not grind them into your food. A whole cored apple is no trouble at all. This is a caution, not a scare. Handle the core the way your grandfather did, straight out to the compost or the hogs, and you never think on it again. Number 6 is the trick that keeps all your work from turning ugly, and it is about browning. Cut an apple and leave it sitting on the board. Inside of 10 minutes it goes brown and dull. That is oxidation, and while it will not hurt you, it robs the batch of the pale golden look that makes a jar worth opening in February. The old answer was sulphur smoke, and I want you to leave that one back in the past. The modern guidance moved away from sulphuring in any closed indoor room because those fumes are hard on the lungs. There is a cleaner way now. You make yourself an ascorbic acid dip. That is plain vitamin C, nothing more. The National Centre for Home Food Preservation gives you the measure, about 1 teaspoon of pure ascorbic acid to a quart of water. No powder on hand. Crush about 1,500 milligrams of vitamin C tablets into that same quart and stir until the water runs clear. Slice your apples 1/8 to 1/4 inch thick. Slip them into the dip and let them sit 10 minutes. Then lift them out and thread them on twine one after another like beads on a rosary. They come out of that bath pale and bright, and they dry that way too. As for what it saves you against the store shelf, I will not throw a dollar figure at you that I cannot stand behind. I will tell you only this. A quart of water and a spoon of vitamin C is about the cheapest insurance in the whole kitchen, and it turns a homely brown batch into something your grandmother would have been proud to set on the table. So set that browning trick aside, neighbour, because number 5 is where the machine age changed the whole timetable. So set that browning trick aside, neighbour, because number 5 is where the machine age changed the whole timetable. Number 5, the dehydrator, and the season it took the weather out of the work. For 7 generations, drying apples meant the hearth, the attic, the loft above the cook stove. It worked, but it answered to the sky. 1 damp week could sour a good batch before it ever cured, and there was no dial to turn. Then the machines came in. The commercial fruit evaporators, 1870s into the 1890s, pulled apple drying out of the farm kitchen and set it up in the factory. Understand me plain. Nobody outlawed the hearth. The machine age simply standardized the heat, and once heat sat on a dial, the guesswork walked out the door. For your people, a good dry meant a fire tended right and a sky that cooperated. For you, it means a setting. That is the trade the machine age made, and it is a fair one to take. Here is the figure worth carrying. The National Centre for Home Food Preservation sets dried apple slices at 130 to 140 degrees, 6 to 12 hours in an electric dehydrator most times, until a slice turns leathery and pliable, like a work glove broke in over a hard season. Now the doing of it, and it is simple work. Preheat the machine first. Lay your slices flat. One layer, no piece touching another, or they steam instead of dry. Rotate the trays top to bottom as they go, because no machine heats dead even. And do not hold me to that clock. 6 hours, 12 hours, it moves. High humidity in the room stretches the drying out long, so you go by the feel of the slice, not the hour on the wall. You are looking for pliable, not brittle. Fold a cooled slice in half. If it cracks sharp, you dried it too hard. If it weeps or feels tacky, it needs more time on the tray. As for money, I will be straight with you. I have not weighed a home batch against a store bag on an honest scale, so I will not hang a dollar figure on it and ask you to trust it. What I can tell you is you own the heat and the apples both, and that has counted for something in this family a long while. That is number 5. Set the heat, mind the feel. Which carries us to number 4, and the question every dried batch asks in month 6. How long will it truly keep? Number 4, storage, and the day you throw it out. Drying is only half the promise. The other half is the jar. The same National Centre for Home Food Preservation gives the plain guidance here. Properly dried fruit, stored airtight in a cool, dark place, keeps about 1 year. Put it in the freezer, and it holds longer still. That 1 year is not a promise you can abuse. It rides entirely on how dry you got the fruit and how tight you sealed it. Here is how your grandfather would have wanted it done, only with the tools we have now. Airtight is the whole game. Glass jars with a tight seal, or vacuum-sealed bags with the air drawn out. Cool, dark, dry. A pantry shelf, a cellar, away from the stove and the window. Then you check it. Open a jar a week after you fill it and look close. If you see moisture beading on the glass, that batch was not dry enough and it will turn on you. And here is the sign that means done. Throw it out, no argument. Fuzz. If a batch blooms grey fuzz, like ash settling on a cold hearth, that jar is finished. Do not pick around it. Do not scrape it off. The whole batch goes. On the money side, same honesty as before. I will not sell you a savings figure I have not measured myself. But a year of sweetness on a shelf, put up by your own hand, is a kind of wealth the checkout lane does not stock. That is number 4. Dry it right, seal it tight, and cull it hard. Which brings us down to number 3, and the oldest trick in this whole book. Number 3. The Schnitz string, and a supper called Schnitz and Knepp. This one belongs to the Pennsylvania Dutch farm households. There is no single founder to name, friend. This was a whole people's habit, worked out over generations of hard winters, and it earned its place at the table with a documented dish, Schnitz und Knepp. Dried apples cooked down with ham and dumplings, a full winter supper built on fruit that was picked in the fall and hung to dry. Schnitz is simply the word for the dried apple pieces, and here is how they made them. Core the apple clean, slice it into rings. Thread those rings onto a length of string, spaced out so the air moves between them. Then hang the string in a dry, well-ventilated space out of direct sun. No machine, no dial, just apples, string, and moving air. Our people hung these strings across the kitchen and along the rafters, and a well-hung batch would cure hard and keep. One caution, as you hang them, ventilation is the point. A cramped, still, humid corner will mould your string before it cures, same as any other method. Give the air a path. And the money. One last honest word on it. I cannot hand you a clean number for what a winter of Schnitz saved a farm family. But a string of dried rings turning into a hot supper of ham and dumplings in February. That is the whole reason our people bothered to dry the fall harvest at all. That is number 3, the string and the Schnitz. And that brings us down to the number 2 spot, and the one hazard that can hide inside a beautiful looking batch. And that brings us down to the number 2 spot. And the one hazard that can hide inside a beautiful-looking batch. You can dry a slice that looks like gold and still get it wrong. The danger is a mould. Penicillium expansum, the blue-green rot that creeps into a bruised apple. When that mold works, it leaves behind a poison called patulin. You cannot taste it. You cannot always see it once the fruit is dried and dark. And the people whose whole job is measuring such things do not treat it as small. The United States Food and Drug Administration set an action level for patulin in apple juice products at 50 parts per billion, 50 parts in a billion. That is how seriously they take a mold that starts in one soft brown spot. Here's the smoking gun. The rot does not announce itself in the finished slice. It rides in on the fruit you were too kind to throw away. So here is the rule your grandfather followed without a laboratory. Cull hard. Every bruised apple, every wormy apple, everyone gone soft at the core, that fruit does not go on the tray. It goes to the hogs or the pile. You dry sound fruit only. And if a finished batch shows fuzz, any bloom of mold at all, you do not cut around it. You do not sniff it and hope. You throw the whole batch out. One spoiled jar is cheaper than one sick winter. That is the whole hazard, friend, and it is beaten by a sharp eye and a hard heart at the sorting table. Now down to number 1, the reason we started, the reason a dried apple sweetens your food clear until spring. Here is the truth of it, told straight. Drying does not add 1 grain of sugar. Not one. What drying does is pull the water out. An apple is mostly water, and when that water leaves, the sugar that was always there, the fructose and the sucrose, gets packed into a smaller and smaller bite, so the slice tastes sweeter on your tongue. Sweeter by far. But the sugar in that whole apple never grew. It only concentrated. Same sugar, less water, more sweetness per bite. That is not a trick. That is chemistry your people ran in the attic long before anyone gave it a name, and that is the whole secret to a sweet pantry. You are not buying sweetness by the bag. You are keeping the orchard's own sweetness and carrying it forward in a jar. Here is how you catch it. Slice your apples 1/8 to 1/4 inch thick, even, so they dry at the same pace. Dip them 10 minutes in water with a little ascorbic acid stirred in, about a teaspoon to the quart, and they stay pale instead of going brown. Then dry them low and slow until they are leathery and pliable, with no wet pocket left in the middle, down to about 20% moisture. That is the line. Any wetter and mould moves in. Dried right. They hold. Then, in the deep of winter, you rehydrate. You drop that dried schnitz into the pot, and it plumps back like a sponge dropped in a rain barrel, drinking, swelling, coming home, into a pie, into a sauce, into Schnitz und Knepp with the ham and the dumplings, the way the Pennsylvania Dutch kitchens did it, sweet in February from fruit you never touched a sugar sack to. Now about that September in the title, I will be honest with you. September is a good hook, but it is not a law. Apples ripen by their kind and by your ground, anywhere from August into October. An early apple comes in August. Your dense keeping apples, the wine saps and the romes, hang on until the frost gets close, so dry when your tree is ready, not when the calendar says. That is the countdown, friend. 7 down to 1. The last practical step is the easiest one to skip and the one that saves the batch. Once it is dry and cooled, seal it airtight and set it in the cool and the dark, and those jars line up on the shelf catching the lamplight like rows of amber. Then check them in a week. If you see 1 bead of moisture inside the glass, it went back to the drying tray. Do not gamble on a cloudy jar. Now tell me something. Which apple do you keep for drying, and how do you put it up? On the string the old way or on the tray? Leave it in the comments. I read them. The one that gets the most comments is the one I build next. If your pantry is thinner than your grandmother's was, that is not your failing. Nobody handed you the knife and the string and the sorting eye. That knowledge got set down a generation or 2 back quiet, while the cheap and the canned took its place. You are just the one picking it back up, and picking it up is how it gets passed on. Which brings me back to a promise. Early on I told you I would come back to the men who ran the first fruit evaporators, the ones who moved apple drying out of the kitchen and into the factory from the 1870s into the 1890s. Here is my honest answer. I know the machines ran, I know the trade shifted, but I will not stand here and hand you a name I have not run to ground myself. Those men deserve their own telling, done right, and I owe you that work before I speak it. So I am holding it, and I will bring it when it is solid. Next time, We go from the apple to the root cellar itself. The forgotten way our people held whole potatoes, cabbages and turnips through a hard winter with nothing but sand, straw and cold earth, and the one temperature line that decides whether they keep or rot. If this brought back something worth keeping, do one small thing. Subscribe. Not for me. For the neighbour who needs this knowledge and has not found it yet. That is how the old ways travel. Keep the old ways. They kept us.